Just check the clicker. Thank you. It's really good to be here today. We thought it's a good chance for us with this project. Some of you may have seen the project. It was obviously completed a couple of years ago, but it's really important for us as it's being a couple of years, there's time now to reflect and see how things are being used, and it was a good time to really come and have those reflections. First, I'd like to acknowledge that the projects themselves are on Wurundjeri, Bourns and Wallarong country, and we pay our respect to the elders past and present, and everyone helped contribute to the projects themselves. So I'm Nick Bourns, Director of Design at NH Architecture, and this is Codey, Lyon, AECOM.
Thanks, Nick. So I think just contextualising our project really briefly to provide a bit of context for the scene setting of how this project emerged. It actually was one of the interim recommendations coming out of Victoria's Royal Commission into our mental health system, which quite evocatively described our system as broken, and that is from start to finish, be it model of care, facility and agency over care pathways. So this project emerged from something that was much bigger than what we were doing and much more enveloping. There are a number of design principles that were set as part of this work that we did, and I think for me the two that really resonated strongly throughout this entire project was agency of care, be it the actual care provision pathway, as well as co-design, and it was something that the project really strongly committed to, and that was co-design of model of care, that was co-design of the facilities themselves as well. And when I say co-design, it was incredibly broad, with people with lived experience of mental health, carers, family members, and a lot of subject matter experts that we'll touch on briefly. And a lot of people will be familiar with some of our built legacy environment. There hadn't been much investment in our mental health services, and there were a quick precedent study of what existed really demonstrated just how degraded the facilities were.
Absolutely. So this is going to be quite awkward, isn't it? We'll work through this.
We'll dance.
So as a project, the project itself was the first wave of future waves, and it was originally going to be the first urban wave with one regional hospital. So it was Royal Melbourne Hospital in the city, Northern Hospital in Epping, Sunshine Hospital in Sunshine, and the McKellar Centre in Geelong for Barwon Health. And really, this was the first wave of getting those immediate beds that were needed for the largest populations. But as Codey talked about, really what we were most interested in was firstly distilling down the key sort of focuses for that work within this sort of the workshopping we did, which was obviously to look at the idea that it needed to be co-designed alongside people with lived experience and whatever that needed. It needed to destigmatise the idea of mental health services, both in where the buildings would be sited, how they'd be positioned, how they could be perceived and what they were built out of. There needed to be good access to light. These needed to be spaces that weren't institutionalised. They need to be incredibly spatially legible and, of course, familiar and domestic. And when we started this, we didn't know what we meant by that.
And I always struggled to talk about how profoundly, personally life-changing this project was, and I don't know, Nick, if you felt it too. But designing really extensively as a co-design service with over 300 individual stakeholders week in, week out over a really long program, it changed the way we practice. We had to be really diligent about genuinely co-designing. We had to change the way that we demonstrated that feedback was taken on board, it was listened to, and we had to think really carefully about how we're talking about and our language and how to be inclusive in what could be a really trauma-filled experience for people who were confronting and had a lived experience of mental health in a design process where we're talking about a really wide range of both really positive issues that we can influence and things that need to be considered from health and safety perspectives. So it was a challenging but thoroughly rewarding experience.
Yeah, we even managed to, sometimes we had to talk about the big things like program and adjusting it to make sure we could have those conversations, or check if the room was becoming unsafe for people, stop a workshop and restart it and do things like that. So it's quite the hard thing to do.
I spent a lot of time saying, whoa, let's just talk about it before we, let's just talk about it before we go further. But there are a lot of different techniques that we used. We used iterative workshopping, which is not unusual, but perhaps slightly different in the way we had to frame it and we had to capture it, we had to demonstrate improvement, and how it changed what we did from, a panopticon model to something something that was much more permissible and flexible and really did meet the needs across a range of stakeholders. We did prototyping, real life, come and feel the space, come and, fill in surveys for us, collect it, touch it, feel it. I'll seek back into this slide in due course because we used modern methods of construction and standardisation, so this really gave us an opportunity to test and elements before we rolled it out across many sites, many times. And of course, building projections so that people could walk around and understand the building. I think we did this in the height of summer, Nick. I think 40 degrees or something. We spent almost a week there with close to 300 people, and it was pretty extensive. Although my favourite experience is we were there and we'd say, all right, everybody, get in the lift with us. And everybody, even though there's no walls, no anything, they'd cram into the lift and the floor would magically take us up to level 3 and we'd be able to look out and have understand how the building worked.
And one of the great things about that, sort of the idea of being in all this process, was that the design outcomes are incredibly integrated. So you can't pinpoint a single thing. You walk into a space like this image here, and there's many elements that come together to make what the space is. There's the views through the courtyard, through the bedrooms, or the view out. There's the way the service is being done across the desks. There's the way that the lounge system's working next to an ADL kitchen. These are all things that came through many conversations that made the space the way that it is now, rather than a single person with a pen on a paper trying to work it out. We started to think about what is design familiarity and safety. What does that mean to people? What is welcoming? When, we still need to meet the health standards, we still need to meet the anti-ligature, we still need to meet the robustness. So how do you start to put those in a box and say those are secure things we need to do? But how do you then start to change the paradigm? Is it about the timber? Is it about a view? Is it about the way that artwork is integrated? Those kind of elements were the conversations we could have. Equally, it's like, how do you see your 24-hour day existing? Yes, you're there for healthcare, but you're also there to recuperate. So what will you do with your time? Do you want to sit in a window? Do you want to have a view out? Would you like to have a space that's separate from the bed? Do you want to make sure you can't see your bathroom? Those are the questions and things we were discussing. Equally, we were talking about, how is it to receive care? Is it to get rid of the us and them from consumer and clinicians? The idea that coming together around a desk on either side, you still have all the things you need from both parties, but you're actually working together on the problem. It's something we brought up, these collaboration hubs that I went just recently to Sunshine Hospital and saw them in action. It makes me so happy. I called my wife on the home and said, this is the best thing we've ever done.
And look, there's a huge amount of choice in these buildings, and I think what's really interesting of it is these were developed out of extensive co-design conversations, and it was really about a building that needed to be all things to all people, right? It wasn't acceptable for it to be enough for the majority. It needed to try and do a lot of different elements, and in my mind, it almost became a bit of a TARDIS. We'll talk about it in a minute because I think that we need to think a little bit critically about what we did and whether or not it was required and how far we actually moved from a base case which was so underperforming to a case that potentially overperforms in some areas, and sort of that almost snap back of a rubber band in terms of how space are utilised and how people are now actually using the building and what we might think differently in future facilities.
Yeah, we'll try to that bit quite quickly, but I think it's important to remember one of the key things about, along with having all the different bits of spaces, what was most important that nearly all spaces need to be connected to the environment. And there's obviously environment as in the sky, the outside, but it's also more things like where you came from, how you got into a building, how you got there, where you're in relation to your home, where's the car park, where's the things. The idea about really understanding being fully connected, not being institutionalised inside a giant TARDIS, actually, that was really important. And that really became about this idea around being spatially legible. So legibility extends past the idea of just understanding where you are in a building, which was important, but it's also understanding how did I get to where I am? What level am I? Where is my bedroom in relation to where I am right now? What's my journey look like through the day through this place? And that became really important to how we actually understood the buildings, but also how we destigmatised them as large institutional health architecture. The idea that from your bedroom you can see everyone parking the cars in Epping Plaza all day and watching them play Skittles with each other is kind of fun and also very grounding. And what came out as a result of that was the idea that the buildings really became building as boundary, which actually had another great benefit, was both that they became these buildings that just looked like part of the fabric of a campus. There wasn't large fencing around them. There wasn't the idea of institutionalisation of that. Equally, within the building, there was very need for many containment boundaries that were visible, because in a sense they became about a tall balustrade to an outside courtyard rather than the idea of a security device.
And it really supported that co-design process where people had said one of the things that was just such a negative experience is fences and being that sense of being contained.
One of the challenges of design for that is, as you might imagine, that when you start thinking about that, you've got to look at the solar access, you've got to look at make sure that all the courtyards have equal amenity. We're doing vertical buildings here, so then you start to have this problem. You carve away your building. Effectively, you're putting the consumer at the heart. So the spaces they occupy, the courtyards, the kitchens, the dining rooms, and the bedrooms become the heart, and you have to plan everything around that. And the challenge being you end up with more space at the bottom than the top.
So as Nick's Swiss cheesing his building to get solar access and high amenity to ground floor courtyards, we really had to think about how you're standardising it. And you had to actually think really carefully and critically about how your building worked as an organism across different floors. So it no longer became about repeating and standardising as the perspective of like just doing the same thing on every level. The building had to work really hard, and you had to think about sharing spaces and making sure that people could move around the building with as much freedom as possible.
Now, I'm obviously conscious of time, but obviously one of the things that comes out of it too is that, we standardised what you were going to have, but each site required different solutions. So you end up with the basketball courts. One's in the sky on bouncing bits, and I think if I ever have to do one of those again and try and get reverberation of a basketball in a mental health environment, I will need one myself.
I don't know how much we fought basketballs the whole way through. We're like ping pongs, table tennis, like badminton, just about anything other than basketballs, but we just could not solve it. It was basketballs, wasn't it?
And the most used spaces now. They're these great spaces that really normalise the care.
But if anything's going to drive you mad, it's a basketball bouncing when you want to rest. So I guess from a design team perspective, continual learning and being us going back and having a look at how buildings function in after the fact, from how we design to what's happening. And there were some real success stories in the design. And for me, one of those particular ones was the staff hubs acting as these anchors without barriers within the care environment. So staff had a place to come back to and to sit at. It was flexible. There were different ways to work at that space, but it was really embedded in the care environment so that consumers didn't have to go looking for anyone. They had that anchor that they came back to. And it does work a little bit like a Swiss Army knife. If you want to work across it like a desk, if you want to sit side by side, or you want to sit in a more casual environment, this furniture really became an occupiable space that really adapts to what people want to do in terms of the conversation. You can have a more private conversation, or you can have a more transactive conversation. So that's been really fascinating. Little things like creating that ADL kitchen as open and just integrating it. It needs less space, but it becomes part of their normal environment. If somebody's sitting around looking a bit quiet, there off you go. Make yourself some eggs on toast or do something, and at which point it becomes less of an assessment and more as a normal practice of day-to-day life. The de-escalation courtyards, the sensory rooms and the courtyard use are just, it's extraordinary how much people use these spaces to manage their behaviour and therefore reduce that seclusive practice. Perhaps more critically, though, I think we've come back to thinking about how things work differently. And if I had my time again, I think I would understand a lot more about how space is used and the sort of response that large co-design groups have to an existing environment. I think it's something that we all are challenged by on a design process. A lot of times people are like, do you know what, we need what we have, but just more of it. And this project was about changing the way we use space rather than just giving more of it. But if I was really critical, one of the things that came out of our project was a really high diversity of spaces, and particularly quiet spaces and quiet lounges, little nooks, places that people could go to have a little bit of solitude but not be in their room. And I don't think people use them as much as we anticipated they would. And I think on reflection, it's because the spaces that they were coming from, the rooms were so limited in their amenity, the outlook was so controlled, they were often shared environment, that the feedback was we need something different to this. Whereas in these buildings where the bedrooms have large windows, they've got a comfy couch, they've got a bed, they've got a desk, people are tending to stay within their own privacy. Whether or not that's good or bad needs that intersection of therapeutic and architecture to come together to say, do you know what, do we need to get them out of the bedroom? But I will say that the building, those spaces aren't used, and they should be more interrogated going forward.
Would you want to start on this one?
Do you know what? I will start on this one. This is one I could spend an entire conversation on.
Let's start.
These projects also embraced the idea of standardisation and modern methods of construction. So there's a bedroom module, there's an ensuite module, there's really clear and really strong design principles that work across all of the projects, with the exception of, we'll talk about it in a minute, yep. But they are designed to be done with off-site construction. So we worked really hard across 3 of the projects to do a whole standardisation of the design to make sure that these facilities could be constructed off-site. We spent an awful lot of time on it. However, when design met market capability and capacity, what ended up happening is that we ended up with 3 different modular contractors. Every single one of them had a different design. Every single one of them had to be bespoke. We had to change details. We had to work, even more to make it standardised. So it was a really interesting conversation, this project, in terms of how design standardisation needs to meet market maturity and capability, how that needs to happen going forward, what we need to do to invest in benefiting from the standardisation within that spectrum. And I think there's a lot of lessons learned.
The way I describe it right now is that imagine that every EV company brought out a car with a different plug. And that's kind of what it is. So we design the function that we want to drive a car, but in actual fact, we need to redesign it once you award the contractor, because they'll have a totally different system, and you need to go currently back to Australian standards and get a deemed to satisfy. So this was for a project that needed to be delivered in 3 years from master plan to occupation. These were big challenges to try and get through at pace. And they were done, and I feel like a whole staff have worn the scars of doing that. But it's certainly something that can definitely grow from here.
I was going to say, it doesn't matter how much you standardise windows and details and modules, if market can't meet it, that needs to be factored in really early so that we can manage it. And we actually ended up having a full range from fully fitted out modules, like completely fitted out, arriving to site, and then we ended up
some were just chassis.
Some were just chassis, and so it was a really interesting juncture of MMC versus design and intent.
But it's interesting. There are some things that when you start to go back to the idea about destigmatisation and the idea about these being architecture that responded to people feeling like they were being cared for. One of the things we found that all of them across the world was that the buildings had their facades and things put on site. Because the idea that modularisation is still currently seen as something as a step down from a building that feels permanent. And that's something we need to work through too, because it shouldn't, but it does at the moment. So this idea that, we heard loud and clear these buildings need to feel like they were invested in at equal weighting to anything else on a hospital campus. And that was really interesting.
And it did change co-design too, because we had to run sessions which were overarching while still allowing sessions for placemaking and space that the buildings didn't all feel exactly the same. And I think you're going to show now that even though there's a lot of DNA that's shared across the project, they ended up being very different.
Yeah, and I think what we're trying to say here is the cake and eat it too. And one of the things we have reflected on is that they all have the same bedrooms, they all have the same facilities, they all have the same square meterage per person for each of the facilities. They are standardised projects. However, they're all designed for place, and they're designed for place with stakeholders who are from that place, both clinicians and staff, and lived experience who have been treated in that place by that hospital. So when you start talking about Sunshine Hospital, which is actually the biggest of the facilities that really wanted to bring together a whole suite of their existing facilities and this, they made the Centre for Wellbeing Centre out of it. It is about being in the Sunshine Plains. It's in the west. We did this whole idea about the brick patterning things, talking about their horizon and the way that they see the Great Plains out to the west. It was also really about, aspirationally around the idea of going to a hotel. The sort of way hotels express their windows, and that sort of form was something we took on board from that workshopping and then brought through into place, and have a big garden to the north. Equally, when we talked about Northern Hospital, which was much more about bringing the idea of this sort of stigmatised unit from the back of a hospital, which used to be next to the sort of ravine by the staff car park, bringing it to the front and putting it on the public entrance. The idea that it would be, in the colours of the hospital, on Produce Way. And they were really interested in the idea about future-proofing. So in fact, this car park level, which you see here, is actually sized and built for the future unit, including the idea of courtyards. So the courtyards would fill in the gap, you see. So the idea this could be then later expanded down. And still really take its place. And this idea that when you're in the Epping Plaza, the biggest place in the north for shopping, you look across and I can see the red light bulb getting there. You can see people move around the building. It's quite normalised. Barwon Health is much more about building to a small village of things, and so bringing that sort of idea about the homeliness and the touch and feel of a place that is actually for occupation and housing into the building. And of course, RMH was a whole different challenge. It was brownfield as brown comes. The idea of clearing out all of level 1 to put in a large outdoor courtyard on the top of the existing library, complete with skylights back through our landscape. The idea that we could find a space in such a gnarly campus. So the same principles that apply for Sunshine need to apply here. And we're really proud of it because even though it's not modular, it has all the same stylisation, the same facilities within an existing building.
And do you know what? In the break, ask me about the art that we put in. There was an entire art program that was dedicated to these projects as well that really changed the look and feel of these buildings and how consumers felt around them. And I have to say, they fill my heart with happiness when I see these images. And there's a coffee table book, and we're really happy to share them with you if it's something that grabs your attention. But perhaps just in the last few seconds, I'd just like to really, again, I reflect on the journey that I've been on and that Nick's been on and our design teams have been on, and the enormous contribution that we had and goodwill by people who participated in our project with lived experience, particularly those with lived experience of mental health and their families and carers. It was an extraordinary contribution that they made to this project, an extraordinary time commitment. And the projects would be very different if we hadn't had them as part of the process.
Thank you. Okay.